Good morning. It's just a few of us, so I know we can be a little bit louder. Good morning. Okay. I'm pleased to have been given the opportunity to preside over this morning's session titled Many Dreams Deferred, The Struggle Continues. And I promise I won't take a whole lot of your time, but Dr. Hill made the mistake of asking the daughter of a Baptist minister to preside. So I just want to remind us that we're here with some powerful scholars, but we're also here because an ancestor sacrificed on our behalf. We're here because an elder sacrificed on our behalf. Somebody allowed their dreams to be deferred, to be delayed, to be morphed into something other than what it first was, so that we could sit here in these comfortable seats, nice and warm from the elements outside, relatively secure in this building with access to books and schooling, so that we could ensure that their struggles would not be in vain. I'm proud to share this space with you in honor of them and preparation of those who are coming on our tomorrows. May we carry with us into this program this morning, into the days to come, the strength and faith that has gotten us this far. I'm feeling like a big groupie this morning, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Charles E. Cobb, formerly a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Brown University. Dr. Cobb served as a field secretary of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in Mississippi from 1962 to 1967. I'm personally very thankful for the work he's done in and around education and freedom schools during his time there. In 1976, Dr. Cobb joined NPR and brought the first regular coverage of Africa to the network. He's also worked with National Geographic and was honored in 2008 by the National Association of Black Journalists as a member of their Hall of Fame. Dr. Cobb has co-authored Radical Equations, Civil Rights from Mississippi to the Algebra Project, and authored On the Road to Freedom, A Guided Tour of the Civil Rights Trail, and most recently, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles E. Cobb.
Good morning. It's always good to see Ruth. I feel like I'm back in Albany now. I'm better at a keyboard than at a microphone, so I won't take a long time. I do have some things to say, both about the movement, certainly as I experienced it, in the 1960s, and what's relevant in our times now. And when I do that, then maybe we can have a conversation, and you can either raise questions with me about the history or about what you're thinking about in terms of now. Here, especially in Albany, though I would say the same thing anywhere I was in the South, it seems especially where SNCC was so deeply involved, it seems especially important to bring up the name Ella Baker, Ella Josephine Baker, because I think it's fair to say that most of us in SNCC, certainly, most of us who were young, in 60, 61, 62 as SNCC evolved, would consider ourselves Miss Baker's children, certainly her political children. I would go further and say there really wouldn't have been a SNCC without Miss Baker, and without question, insofar as we were concerned, she was the most influential adult, grown-up, that we encountered, the grown-up we listened to the most. So I can't start without saying something about Miss Baker, and in this instance I want to use Miss Baker's words to us to set the tone, to set the theme for this morning's discussion. This is Mrs. Baker, or Miss Baker, and she was Miss Baker to us because she was 57 years old when she brought together the young people who would form SNCC in Raleigh, North Carolina. and we were 19, 18, 20, 21. There was no way she could be anything other than Miss Baker. So this is Miss Baker speaking to us in 1965. And she says, in order for us as poor and oppressed people to become a part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means we are going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. That is easier said than done. But one of the things that has to be faced is, in the process of wanting to change that system, how much have we got to do to find out who we are, where we have come from, and where we are going? I'm saying, as you must say too, that in order to see where we are going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. It's Miss Baker speaking to us in 1965, and I think the words are as appropriate in the year 2015 as they were in 1965, if not more appropriate in some respects. So that, my father was a preacher, so that is our text for today. Now, let's start, in fact, with Albany. The historiography really treats Albany poorly. You know, what the sort of mainstream historiography says is that the Albany movement was a failure. And we learned several things from this version of the history of Albany that we, one, have a problem with who declares and determines what's legitimate history. And if you look at the history of the movement, and this is a problem not only with Albany, this is, you know, right across the South, right across the presentation of movement, history, this top-down approach to history. Good morning. Is a problem. The reason Albany's movement has been declared a failure is because the people who made the movement, like Rutha over here, are ignored by the historians. So we don't know about Rutha Harris or her brother Emory, or any number of people, Reverend Samuel Wells. If you know, we know Bernice Johnson more because of Sweet Honey in the Rock than we know of her struggle and her leadership in the struggle right here on the campus of Albany State, from which she was expelled because of it. So that's one problem. The deification of Martin Luther King, and this is not a criticism of Reverend King, it's just a fact. It's a problem. The reason the Albany movement is considered a failure is because Reverend King felt it was a failure. And he said so in an interview. I'll give you, he said, the mistake I made there was to protest against segregation generally rather than against a single and distinct facet of it. I'm not going to get into Reverend King's analysis, but I only quote him by way of contrasting what he said with, say, Bernice Johnson. She says, when I read about the Albany movement, as people have written about it, I don't recognize it. They add up stuff that was not central to what happened. Or A.C. Searles, who some of you may know was the editor of the Southwest Georgian back in the days of the Albany movement. And in an interview, he said, "What did we win? We won our self-respect. It changed my attitudes. This movement made me demand a semblance of first-class citizenship." So if you want to do the history, say, of the Albany movement, it seems to me you need to point yourself in that direction. And that's what the historiographers do not do. Nor do they point you, the other success, which is much more relevant than what I want to take 5 or 10 minutes talking about, the other aspect of the Albany movement that's critically important and is largely ignored in the historiography is the fact of its impact in all the surrounding counties, Terrell County, Baker County, Lee County, Sumter County. You know, Albany was the base in which a whole core of young people spread out to organize people around voter registration, to organize people around social change. And one of the most ignored aspects of the Southern freedom movement is the fact that in many respects it was rooted in rural struggle more than urban struggle, and that it was a movement of grassroots organizing more than a movement of protest marches. So let me, in that vein, then outline what I think are 3 aspects that you need to understand if you really want to understand the movement and you really want to think through how to apply what the movement was to struggle today. One is what you see, and you see it here in Albany very clearly, just the way I saw it in Mississippi where I worked very clearly in the 1960s. You see a convergence of young people with older people who are willing to put at the disposal of young people both their experience in struggle and networks that they had developed over years, in some instances before most of us were born. And that's really the meaning of what you see when you look at the Albany movement that was headed by Dr. Anderson, that was leading those protests. You see this convergence of young people, and not just as participants, but young people in leadership positions. The significant thing about the 1960s, it seems to me, and it's reflected in both SNCC and it's reflected in the expansion of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. You see the emergence of young people into leadership roles. You know, because before the 1960s, if you talked about civil rights leadership, you were talking about grown-ups. You were not talking about people like Charles Sherrod, you know, who was, 22, I guess, when he came here to Albany. We're not talking about people like Bernice Johnson or Bertha Goeb or any number of people, Blanton Hall, that I could tick off just from Albany alone, Amanda Perdue, et cetera. So this convergence, and they found that there were grown-ups who were willing to help them. So that's the first thing, and that seems extremely relevant today. I want to talk about Ferguson in a few minutes to really illustrate that. The second thing you see is that ordinary people who were usually spoken for by others, and they were either spoken of sympathetically, as liberals, particularly white liberals, often did, or they were spoken of with hostility, as the Ku Klux Klan and other groups did. You know, in Mississippi there were white terrorist groups that thought the Ku Klux Klan was too liberal. But people who were usually spoken for or about by others found their own voices and began to speak for themselves in ways in which they could not be ignored. In Mississippi, that's Mrs. Hamer's story. And there are any number of people throughout Southwest Georgia. I'm thinking of Mama Dolly Raines, I'm thinking of Carolyn Daniels, and I mean people like that, ordinary people, maids, cooks, small farmers, small entrepreneurs, sharecroppers, who were spoken for by others, found their own voice and began to speak in ways in which they could not be ignored, and in doing so changed not only the South, but changed the country. You have Barack Obama as President of the United States precisely because black people, most of them in rural communities, fought for full citizenship. That's why you have him. That's why Hillary Clinton is even considered a serious candidate. This struggle that unfolded not just in these Southwest Georgia counties, but in the Mississippi counties, and the Alabama counties, and the South Carolina counties, and the counties up in the Arkansas Delta, fought. And in fighting, changed not only their immediate communities, but changed the country. That's not always good because all those Dixiecrats went into the Republican Party, but nonetheless, it was a change, and that change has resulted in Obama. That's a whole nother lecture that I won't burn you with. The last thing I want you, of these three things I'm trying to highlight that I want you to understand in the sense of understanding the history, as Ms. Baker spoke of understanding the history, and perhaps the most important aspect of this and the most relevant today. As much as black people and black struggle challenged white supremacy, more importantly, more significantly, what you see, again, looking at Albany in the 1960s, or Mississippi where I was in the 1960s, what you see is black people challenging black people to make a change. And then that's the other dimension of Ms. Baker's words that I read to you. It is, you have to make a struggle. You have to make the change. And you see that everywhere. You know, I've been a working reporter all of my life since leaving the South, and like most reporters, I have 4 or 5 stories in my back pocket. I won't tell you all of them, but 2 seem relevant, 1 personal, and 1 just to flesh out the historical record, because I like to emphasize this business of black people challenging each other. 1 is how Martin Luther King emerged as a leader. In Montgomery, Alabama, during the bus boycott in 1955, 1956, that began in 1955, was just supposed to be a 1-day boycott. The boycott was so successful that one day that ministers and other people, but mostly ministers, met in Martin Luther King's church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, to discuss maybe extending the boycott until the city gave in and desegregated the buses. And the fact was, most of the ministers were afraid to do that. And they were coming up with all these excuses about, wow, maybe we ought to form a delegation and go and talk to the city. That anybody involved in these struggles knows that kind of attitude. I don't have to elaborate on it. Well, then the real leader of Montgomery rose to speak. He was a man, E.D. Nixon, who was one of A. Philip Randolph's people, sleeping car porter in the Union of Sleeping Car Porters. He had also been the president of the NAACP. He rose to speak after all this hemming and hawing and looked over at the crowd. This story comes to me from a woman who's passed away now, Johnny Carr, a great woman, and she lived to be 96 years old. Ms. Carr said, he looked over at the audience and said, and this is Miss Carr's quote, he said, "You preachers been eating these women's fried chicken long enough, and now it's time for you to get up off your behind and do something for them." That's what Miss Carr told me E.D. Nixon said. And then he went on to accuse the ministers of cowardice and not wanting to continue this bus boycott. And so that kind of speech, and you all have to know people here who are just like that. And that's when Martin Luther King, then 26 years old, and people forget Martin Luther King was a young guy when he emerged out in the Montgomery protest. Martin Luther King, then 26, stood up and said, "I am not a coward." And that changed the tenor of the meeting. They organized the Montgomery Improvement Association that night, that evening, because they were going later on in that evening to another mass meeting at Whole Street Baptist Church. They organized the Montgomery Improvement Association, and they made Martin Luther King the head of it. And that was his first step into public leadership. So should we understand this story? What you're looking at is challenges of black people to other black people within the black community and how it affects change. And that in some respects is my story. One of the questions I get asked often is, well, how did you wind up in Mississippi anyway, Charlie? Because I'm from Washington, D.C. And I had been involved in the sit-ins and was on the way to a workshop for sit-in students in Houston, Texas. In those days, you didn't fly. I took the bus. I was 19 years old, from Washington, D.C., through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Houston, Texas. But I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, because the students were sitting in. You know, from my generation anyway, Mississippi was the worst place we could imagine for a black person. Maybe the worst place in the entire universe, not just Earth, for a black person. And I felt that it was one thing for me to be sitting in as a Howard University student in Virginia, in Maryland. It was qualitatively different for students in Mississippi to be sitting in. So I wanted to meet them in case they had some kind of gene that gave them some special degree of courage. And I made my way to their headquarters and introduced myself to them. And one of these students, Lawrence Guiot, who would later become chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but then at Tougaloo, a great big guy, you remember him, after I finished saying, well, yeah, I'm going to Texas for this workshop, and I just wanted to introduce myself to you. I've been sitting in Virginia and Maryland, He gets up and he kind of hovers over me and then begins to speak with complete disdain. And he says, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights? What's the point of that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" And then another one of those students, Jesse Harris, who just passed away, chimes in and he says, "Yeah, Charlie, you're in the war zone here." And I got the message, you know, yes, you can go off somewhere and chatter about civil rights if you want. But if you're serious, then you'll join us because we're getting ready to do stuff in Mississippi. There's more to that story than that, but I won't go into it here. The point is, I wound up staying in Mississippi, and my attitude at first, well, it's the summer, I could stay for the summer, and basically I didn't get out of Mississippi for the next 5 years. And the why of that is, again, too lengthy to go into in front of this microphone, but the point I really want to make with that personal story is, again, just the way that Martin Luther King was being challenged by E.D. Nixon at Montgomery, Alabama, these students whom I had just met were challenging me. If you're serious, Charlie, that we're getting ready to do stuff in Mississippi and you'll stay and work with us. So you see this story, kind of story, repeated over and over and over again in the movement history. Now, to skip a whole time span, and because of time, you know, in Mozambique during the War for Independence, they used to say, "A luta continua," the struggle continues. And that's true. So, and that brings me to Ferguson. And it brings me to what's happening now. Because you see, you know, one of the things the older people who took us in, they had a plan in their head. And it basically involved using all that student energy they saw, you know, engaged in sit-ins and freedom rides and the like. And they had an agenda, especially the NACP guys, and here I mean the local NACP people. I mean, they wanted to use our energy to gain voting rights. Their attitude was, and I had more conversations with them than I can remember, that if we gain the right to vote, we gain the power to dislodge some of these oppressive local regimes. We can replace the county sheriffs. We can replace the boards of supervisors. We can replace the mayors. And I mean, that was their agenda. And they saw the students sitting in as being the energy they needed to do this. Now, there's a lot of student energy that has emerged in the last few years, and a lot of it reminds me of what the 1960s was like. Now, what we figured out how to do with the help of people like Ella Baker and others was, in a way, transform ourselves from protesters to organizers. And we figured out how to embed ourselves in small southern communities and begin to work with people at the grassroots to effect change. That question is still up in the air today. And parts of it are easier than others. In Ferguson, for instance, there's an organizing mission to be done. And maybe they will figure it out, maybe not, I'm not sure. We have a SNCC legacy project, and we've been in conversation with some of the young people in Ferguson and some other young people. I live in Florida, so I've been in conversation with the Dream Defenders. And I'm currently, over the last few months, been in North Carolina, so I've been in conversation with the Moral Monday students. There's a lot of student energy out here. You have to make your way to them, and you find that they're interested in what old people like me. I have to interrupt this just to give you one more story, and the reason I feel this is important is on a book, I did another book some years back, and I was back in Mississippi to give a copy to some of the people who helped me, and I was sitting on the steps of a middle school in Jackson, Brinkley Middle School, which, as it happens, is across the street from the Fannie Lou Hamer Public Library. It's in Medgar Evers' old neighborhood, and I went into old guy mode, what I only say half jokingly, and decided to engage these middle school kids in a conversation about Miss Hamer, and I asked them if they knew Mrs. Hamer. And if not a one of them, I was with a half a dozen sitting on the steps, knew Mrs. Hamer. So I said, well, you need to know something about her. She's important to Mississippi. And then I said, I knew her. And I would be back in a few days, and I can talk to you about her. And I was getting ready to tell them a Mrs. Hamer story that I thought would engage them. But when I said I knew her, one of these students, middle school students, leapt to his feet, stared at me in total amazement, and said in words I will not forget, "Mr. Cobb, you was alive back then?" So this question of interacting with young people is very, very important to me, and has been since that moment. And what's striking about Ferguson, and I use it often as an example, is that here's a town that's 2/3 black. It has a 5-person city council, but only one black person on it. It has a 53-person police force, and only 3 black policemen on it. So what's the problem? What's the need? The need is to organize to get rid of the government. And that's easier to do today than it was in 1960 Southwest Georgia or 1960s Albany, Georgia. So that's a piece of and what we had to learn how to do is precisely what young people today have to learn how to do, and that's actually sit down and talk to people in order to organize them. I don't think you'll be able to do this via Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. That's useful in the way that mimeograph machines were useful to us. I was telling some students about the mimeograph machine once, and they didn't have a clue as to what I was talking about. But so there's this organizing mission around political power, I think, and I think the dimension of political organization that has to be tackled today that we really didn't quite address is not simply getting people elected to office, but holding people we elect to office accountable to us and what we need. And that's a little bit harder than just getting somebody elected to office. This is a discussion the young people need to have. They can dip into people like me to the degree that they feel it's necessary. But it's really an organizing discussion that I think young people. The other part of the 60s, which I emphasize, as I told you I emphasize, the challenges black people make to one another within the black community centers on the question of violence. It's quite striking to me that in my book, and remember my latest book is This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. I am not, unlike say Charles Sherrod, my friend here in Albany, Georgia, I am not, I say right up front, philosophically committed to nonviolence as a way of life. I'm just not, mainly because I don't have the courage to live that way. It's as simple as that. There's no real philosophical disagreement if I talk to Sherrod about nonviolence. I'm not brave enough to do that. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do that. But it's indisputable, it seems to me, whether you talk about Albany, Georgia, or Mississippi, that nonviolent struggle was a powerful factor in how the South changed. For all the unresolved issues, for all the unanswered questions. Nonviolent struggle changed the South and changed. So it's quite striking to me that it barely exists as an idea in black and Latino communities that are faced with horrific violence. You know, we all know the stories. You know, some gunfight over territory and some kid sitting on the porch or sitting in the window gets killed. You know, the stupid violence around retaliation. You know, you dissed me. Out comes the MAC-10 or whatever. Bang, you're dead. You won't diss me anymore. So it seems to me that this whole question of violence in our communities is a challenge that needs to be taken up by people in our communities. And how to do that, while not clear, it does seem to me that, again, the experience in the South around nonviolent struggle and talking to people about nonviolence might offer some clues. Randy Battle, who was from here, was a gang leader before he became involved with the movement. So how did people talk to Randy? What did he see in the movement that caused him to commit to this movement, at least, and I'm not saying Randy, because I know Randy did commit to nonviolence as a way of life, but he committed to what kind of language brought him into the movement. If we knew that or tried that, we might find a path to at least beginning to tackle this violence. Something I'm thinking about, something I might write my next book about. What I want to say to the young people here today in conclusion is simply that it seems to me the future is yours, not mine. The future is yours to make or to run away from you. And I would say, and I don't think if you want to make your future that you need to wait for me to pass you the torch. I think you should seize it just the way we did. Thank you. I think there's questions, yes, or comments, questions. I'm open, vulnerable. I know I didn't speak perfectly.
Are you at Brown now, or you?
No, I left. I should talk about this a little bit. I was a visiting professor at Brown University, which meant I taught one seminar once a week.
Where are you now?
I've never been a professor or a teacher. I am currently at Duke University, not as a teacher, but as a scholar activist. We formed after the SNCC's 50th anniversary where we had a conference and commemoration in Raleigh, North Carolina, where SNCC was born. Some of us formed a SNCC Legacy Project. And what we're concerned about is both generating original material from SNCC people about what they did in the South, and also identifying where material about SNCC exists in various archives, personal collections, and the like. We have entered into a formal relationship with Duke University to do a pilot, one person, one vote website. That website concentrates on SNCC's work around voter registration in 3 areas: Southwest Georgia, Mississippi, and Lowndes County, Alabama. And that site will combine both original material and existing material. I've done a series of interviews over the last 6 months with SNCC people in various parts, just pulling out their recollections so that we can use them on the website. we're profiling about 80 of the people on the site right now. It'll expand. If the pilot works, and it looks like it's going to work very well, and Duke is very excited about it. We're in conversations with them about expanding this to a 3 to 4 year project in which we attempt to cover all of SNCC's work. And I stress, this is not the whole, to talk about SNCC is not to talk about the entire movement. We're talking about SNCC's work, because that's where we came out of. You could replicate what we're doing, CORE could, or SCLC could, or any organization, but we're doing SNCC. This is what SNCC did. This is what, and we make the case that what makes SNCC significant, aside from its work, is the fact that for the first time it brought young people into leadership positions in the movement with their own independent ideas. And that can be modeled in the future, that young people can take. And one of my discomforts with all the protests over Ferguson and some of the other protests over violence, police violence at young black people, that sometimes it just seems smothered. The voice of young people seems smothered by old people. And I'm not hostile to old people, believe me. But it seems smothered. You know, I just began to notice this at the commemoration of the March on Washington, the 50th of the March on Washington, where young people weren't let on the stage to say anything, really. So we're trying to generate a site that says, yeah, you need to listen to young people, and we want young people to look at the site and say, we can do something like that now. And that's what I'm doing at Duke. It's a long, involved, convoluted answer to your question. Well, the phase, we're in a period that reminds me in some ways of the earliest days of the movement, the protest days of the movement, when people, you know, Black Lives Matter. And I'm not hostile or against protests. After all, I came out of student protests myself as a Howard University student. But it seems to me what rings similar, you know, when the Dream Defenders in Florida, where I live, had a sit-in for 31 days at the governor's office, you know, to protest stand your ground laws and other things they disagreed with. It reminded me of me as a 19-year-old. When I'm in North Carolina now, the Moral Mondays group, they've been having regular protests, you know, directed at the governor and the state legislature. What reminds me of SNCC. And I see that in various places, the Cure Violence people out in the West Coast. There are a bunch of the dreamers out there. So in that respect, the movement is very similar. You see all of this young energy. So far, they haven't, and I think I said this, haven't figured out how to take this energy and use it as organizers, as distinct from protesters. And I think it's an important distinction. And to say you need to transform yourself into organizers is not to denigrate protest. I mean, because Sherrod and the SNCC people here also began to turn their attention to Terrell County and Baker County and Sumter County and Lee County and these rural counties that surround Albany, doesn't mean that the protest that was unfolding in Albany was somehow illegitimate. You know, it's just the next step. That's the discussion we are having with some of the young people right now. We're saying to them, we're not here to tell you what to do. We can't tell you what to do because you're fighting for your future. But we have some experiences that we're willing to share with you. And if you find them useful, fine. If you don't think they're useful, that's fine too. But we're willing to interact with you at that level. And we're having varying degrees of success with you. There are a number of issues today that we didn't have to face in the 1960s, starting with, in my view, the kind of violence that exists inside black communities. You know, and then there are national issues like the erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security. I mean, there are issues out here, economic issues are much larger today than they even were in the 1960s, when there was certainly a lot of poverty around in southwest Georgia or Mississippi. And lastly, there's a huge issue directly affecting young people around public education. Quality public education in public schools strikes me as being as much a civil rights issue as voting rights were in the 1960s. So how do you organize for that? Now, Bob Moses, who was a SNCC field secretary in Mississippi, is doing a lot of work in this arena. So there's no shortage of, and these are my views. I don't know, if you sat down with a group of young people, they might have a whole nother set of issues that concerns you. There's enough young people here for one or two to stand up and say what your issues are if you wanted to organize something in this area. I can't stand here and declare these are your issues, Albany State students. And that was the other great thing Ella Baker did for us. She more or less kept out of the way of our, as Joyce Ladner, who was a part of SNCC and who would eventually for a time be president of Howard University, said the SNCC people will argue with a lamppost. And she more or less got out of the way of our conversation, only injecting herself when she thought we were really just too far off. And I'm inclined to be the same way. Well, Shaw was where SNCC was born. To say Shaw is the same as Miss Baker, a remarkable woman, was a graduate of Shaw University. She graduated, she was valedictorian of her class at Shaw University. And when the sit-ins erupted, Miss Baker recognized right away this student energy. And I should say, Miss Baker had been in the 1940s the NACP director of branches. So there was a whole network of local NACP branches that she had organized. Miss Baker was the person who really organized Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became its first executive director. Actually, her official title was temporary executive director because she was a woman, and these preachers had a lot of trouble with women in leadership roles. So she becomes temporary executive director. They don't have an executive director until Wyatt T. Walker, a preacher out of Richmond, replaces her. He becomes really, if you read the history, Wyatt T. Walker is the first executive director. Miss Baker was the temporary executive director. But in any case, when the sit-ins erupted in 1960, and Miss Baker recognized this student, and she got $800 from Martin Luther King to bring the students together at her alma mater. This was on Easter weekend of 1960. And it was just what she thought, wisely in my view, that these student activists should talk to one another, because nobody knew, the Howard students didn't know, the A&T students in Greensboro, or the students at Orangeburg, at South Carolina State. So Ms. Baker wisely said, well, these students should talk to one another and begin to think about what else they wanted to do. And in her opening address, that was the title of her speech, Bigger Than a Hamburger. And she said, this is about more than getting a hamburger or a cup of coffee. And Martin Luther King gave the money for this conference because he wanted a student wing to his organization, SCLC. That's what he had in mind. And Ms. Baker was going around saying, well, you need to be thinking about forming your own organization. You don't need to be a part of a grown-ups organization. So she really planted that idea. I talk some about it in this book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, about that SNCC conference and the emergence of independent student organization. And Shaw could do this because it was not a state school. And that's important. I don't know how important that is today, but then the distinction between being a state school or a private institution, often a church-based related institution, was extremely important to how students could operate. You can get expelled from Albany State, as Bernice Johnson got expelled, and other students got expelled. On the other hand, Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, the president, had the teachers visit the students in jail to keep them up with their classes, because it was not dependent on the state. So Shaw, certainly to SNCC, it's extremely important both at the level of hosting SNCC's founding conference and also at the level of educating Ella Baker, who was so important to SNCC. No, this book is a Southern story. It's a book about Southern organizing, which to me is largely centered in the rural South. And if you're talking about the rural South, certainly back then, guns, black or white, were part of the culture. People used guns to go hunting, to put food on the table. People used guns to keep varmints out of the gardens in the backyards. And people used guns to protect themselves from marauders. This is the big change in the mid-20th century. I think, and I argue in the book, that World War II had a lot to do with this, and the veterans who returned home after fighting Nazis and Japanese and Italian fascists, that what the Klan discovered was that people they were shooting at were increasingly inclined to shoot back. And as my friend Worth Long, who was a SNCC field secretary, I don't think he worked here in Albany, says, to my view rather succinctly, if you're dead, you don't make a good organizer. So you want the short answer to how guns made the civil rights movement probably kept us alive. Charles Sherrod told me a story. I should tell you this in closing, and by way of commercial for the book. I had a conversation with Sherrod about his conversion or his embrace of nonviolence as a way of life. And within the context of talking about that, I mean, I naturally asked, I said, you mean guns never came up within the context of your movement work here in Southwest Georgia? And then he told me a story about Mamadali Raines in Lee County, as I recall, who would sit up at his bedroom window with her shotgun because Sherrod was staying there. And I said, I asked him, I said, well, doesn't that contradict? I mean, did you tell her to put the shotgun away? He says, no. I said, well, what'd you think about the shotgun? And I phrased it this way accidentally, and he answered the question literally. He said, I don't know nothing about no shotgun. Mama Riley Raines knows about the shotgun. And of course, she's not alive for me to talk to. I also asked him if he ever protected himself. And he thought for a minute, and he said, yes. I asked him if he was ever concerned about protecting himself. And he said, yes, when I got married and when I had children. So I asked him, I said, what did you do? And he said, I got 4 big dogs and kept a dog until my children were grown. So everybody, I don't tell you that story to in any attempt to undermine Sherrod's commitment to nonviolence, because there's nobody I personally know that has a deeper commitment to nonviolence as a way of life than Charles Sherrod. But we find there are ways, you have to balance that commitment with the practicalities of living. In some respects, it was easy for us to do because the people with the guns were not young black militants. They were old people our parents' age and our grandparents' age. And there's no way a 19-year-old Charlie Cobb is going to tell the 76-year-old Joe McDonald, who he's staying with, to put away the shotgun. There's just no way that can be done. And anyway, I tell all of those kinds of stories in this book, and I firmly believe that there would have been a lot more bloodshed, a lot more death if these people who were old enough to be our parents or our grandparents hadn't protected us. Their attitude was, well, they would feel they would tell you they're in the nonviolent movement even as they're cleaning their rifles. And I, to this day, remain grateful to them, unapologetically grateful to them. Thank you.
Let's thank Dr. Cobb again for There are a couple of themes that I wanted to pull out of Dr. Cobb's speaking this morning. One is the power of intergenerational connections. We have to be connected to someone older than us and to someone younger than us, right? Because the elders have helped clear the way. We, the youth, are strong enough to keep fighting that fight, but we have to teach someone younger than us how to do it. And we only learn those things by talking to people like Dr. Cobb. So thank you for your work, your continued commitment to the struggle. Thank you. I also want to talk a little bit about an author many of you may not have heard of. His name is Olcott Pivatek. And Pivatek wrote one of my favorite essays. It's called The Artist, the Ruler. And Pivatek's main premise in his essay is that it's not politicians, it's not the royalty who rule a land, it's the artists. Those people who can give us a glimpse into a vision. Those are the people who truly rule. If we think about the film Selma and Ava DuVernay's work as director, she has almost single-handedly rescued King from liberals who would have us believe he was a warm, fuzzy teddy bear. That's the power of an artist.